Mark put a lot of work into that. Thank you, Mark, for that. It really was Joel Messick. I'm just very thankful for what you've done. Before we get started with our guest speaker, I just want to share a little bit I am super excited to have Senator Nathan Dahm here. One of the reasons is, with the state legislature like we have, there's so many examples that we know of people going into there and compromising on what they said they were going to get elected for, what they said they would do. And I've followed Senator Nathan Dahm for the past 2 years, what he's done, and I wrote in one of the examples inviting him here is a hallmark of conservatism. Like, he is the mark. If you're going to look at something that is, what is conservatism doing in the state of Oklahoma? And so I'm just super thankful he's here to kind of explain to us what's going on. What is the red flag laws? Because we hear a lot of talk about that from both sides, and Republicans are even taking both sides of that. So we're super excited. If you guys don't mind giving him a round of applause and just welcome him.
Thank you all for having me. Let me start off by saying, I'm very easygoing. If you have to get up and go to the bathroom, take a phone call, those ladies that are serving us, no, you will not disturb me at all. Even if you have to ask a question, don't hesitate to talk to, the customers and everything. That stuff doesn't bother me at all. So, please, this is very informal. I'm going to want to answer a lot of questions. I actually prefer to do Q&A. I know as an elected official, politician, or whatever, I'm not supposed to do that because that's when you get in trouble. But I prefer to talk about what you want to talk about rather than just what I want to talk about. Thank you, though, for having me. Whenever you get invited to speak somewhere, there's always a little bit of concern of, what type of crowd is it going to be. But then when I heard Don Spencer was here, I was really concerned about what kind of crowd it's going to be. Of course, Don is awesome. He's been a huge asset. He's been so helpful at the state capitol level, working with him. And Charlie, appreciate all that you've done. I mean, I wouldn't have been here if it wasn't for OPAC helping me out in my race and everything. So many people. I acknowledge that what I have done is not about me. Yes, I've been one of the people. I've been the face. It's been my name on a bill. But it's not about me. There's so many other people. So it's been my honor and privilege to serve and do what I've been able to accomplish for the greater good for us all. So I just want to say that to start off with. I do have a couple of pocket constitutions. I always keep some in my car, so if you don't have one, I'd be happy to give you one, especially the younger people in the crowd. You need to have a pocket constitution. I was reading the Constitution from an early age, but I was an nerdy kid, so. But there's nothing wrong with that. So I'm a strong constitutionalist. I believe in upholding the Constitution. Huge fan of our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence. I had the opportunity, I was at a conference just this last week, and in fact drove in from Austin this morning and got in at 3 a.m. So if I'm slow or misspeak, I'm a little tired. But I had the opportunity to speak to over 400 college kids that are interested in the principles of liberty, that they are fighting socialism. This current generation, millennials, sometimes we get a bad rap, but I'll tell you that there's a lot of young people that truly understand the principles of liberty and are trying to fight for that for our country. But I had the privilege of being on a panel with a couple of the legislators, and they specifically asked me about my background, because I have a different background, a unique background. For those of you that don't know, I grew up on the mission field. My parents are missionaries. So I grew up in a formerly communist country, in a very socialist country. So I've seen socialism firsthand. And that's why I hate socialism, because I've experienced it. I've seen it. It's not theoretical with me. It's not free college for everyone, free cars, free phones, free healthcare. That's not what it is. I've experienced it firsthand. And with this current push for free healthcare and all these things, I can tell you that I've actually been to hospitals in socialist countries. I've experienced it. People don't realize this, but in a lot of socialist ran hospitals and healthcare systems, people have to share beds. Like, there was one church member one time who went in for a surgery, came out of the surgery, and was sharing a bed with somebody who was in a coma because they didn't have enough bed space. Yeah, it's free healthcare. I mean, you're paying for it, but it's not quality healthcare. And we can talk about the issues with our healthcare system here in America, and we have plenty of those. Most all of it is because of government interference, how far down we've gone with our healthcare. But I say all that to say, socialism is not just this idea for me. It's something that I've lived, I've experienced, I've seen it. That's why I am so adamant about following the Constitution. That's why I'm so adamant about the Second Amendment, right to keep and bear arms. It is not a right to keep and bear arms solely for hunting. The Founding Fathers put the Second Amendment in the Constitution because they had just lived through the experience of dealing with a tyrannical sportsman. It's not for hunting. Yes, of course you can use it for those things, but that's not what it's for. So I recently filed the red flag bill, or rather the anti-red flag bill. And so, I've had a lot of questions from reporters, and they ask me, well, what do you say about mass shootings when these mass shootings take place? And I've been reminding them, and I've actually seen a few reporters that the light has flicked on in their head when I said it. The first mass shooting, or main recorded mass shooting that we have in America was in Boston. Do y'all remember this? We know it as the Boston Massacre. When British troops, British government officials, fired on British citizens. Because at that point in time, they weren't Americans, they weren't just colonials, they were British citizens. Not just British subjects, they were citizens. So the British government turned on their own people and massacred them. 6 of them died in Boston. That's why it made the news, because it was this atrocity that had never happened before. Well, it had, but it was, throughout history, governments had turned on their people. But this was the first start to it. How many of you have heard of the Battle of Lexington and Concord? The shot heard around the world, right? What was that? That was the British government, British troops, going to confiscate weapons from British citizens. They were going to disarm the people, to take firearms from the people. That's what red flag laws are. That's what they're trying to do. Now, it's a more subtle way. It's not directly going about that. It's not as blatant and as obvious. But there's already over a dozen states that have enacted red flag laws. And there's people that have been killed because of it. In Maryland, a gentleman, he was in his 60s, I believe he was 61. Law enforcement showed up at his house, 5 in the morning, 5:30, sometime around 5 in the morning, showed up to his house, knocked on his door to confiscate his firearm. Shots were fired, and he was killed. It was later found out he wasn't breaking any laws, he wasn't guilty of anything. The day before, a strange family member had been visiting and didn't like the fact that he had firearms, and so reported him. And so the government said, without any due process, okay, we're going to come and we're going to take your firearms, and instead they took his life. So for those who say, well, we need red flag laws because we can't lose a single innocent life. Well, you are losing innocent lives through confiscation of firearms because he was innocent. He hadn't done anything wrong. Is his life valuable? Absolutely. And these mass shootings that take place are not going to be stopped because of red flag laws. They aren't. That's just the reality of it. The problem with red flag laws, there's numerous problems with them, but essentially what a red flag law is, for those of you that don't know, it's called a red flag law because that sounds better. But what it really is it's an extreme risk protection order, is the official terminology for it. And what it is a neighbor, a family member, maybe somebody that you were previously in a relationship with can notify law enforcement, and they can say, hey, this person is a risk to themselves or others, and they have firearms, and those firearms need to be taken away. And so the police will come and they will confiscate your firearms without you having an opportunity to stand for yourself, to face your accusers, to be able to find out why the order has been issued against you. It violates almost every aspect of the Bill of Rights. If you go through the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment is sometimes violated by red flag laws because you can be punished for free speech. Somebody else can interpret it as threatening speech. If you haven't threatened them, they can say, well, I feel threatened by your speech, therefore I'm going to turn you into law enforcement and you're going to get your guns confiscated. So it's a violation of the First Amendment. It's an obvious violation of the Second Amendment because the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I mean, it's the one right in the Bill of Rights that says shall not be infringed. So it's a blatant violation of that. Not really a violation of the Third Amendment dealing with troops quartered in houses, but it's a violation of the Fourth Amendment of unreasonable searches and seizures. It's a violation of the Fifth Amendment of due process. It's a violation of the 6th Amendment, the 7th Amendment, the 8th Amendment. If you go through all the different amendments, you'll see this. It's even a violation of the 9th Amendment. It says, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. It's a violation of the 10th Amendment because the federal government doesn't have any authority to do this. So if you read through the Bill of Rights, red flag laws violate almost every provision of the Bill of Rights in one way or another. And that's just not who we are as a country. That's not who we are as Americans. We are innocent until proven guilty, not guilty until you can go before a judge 30 to 90 to 120 days later and find out why they took your firearms, why they took your property. And so red flag laws just fly in the face of everything that we should hold dear as Americans by saying that you are guilty until proven innocent. So that's why I took a stand against it. That's why I filed my bill that would oppose it. And so my bill would do three main things. First of all, the red flag laws that are being proposed in Washington, D.C. One thing that they want to do is they want to be able to enforce red flag laws on the federal level where they can go to a federal judge and get an issue to be able to take your firearms. My bill would say that any federal red flag law issued by a federal judge or federal judiciary, federal law enforcement is non-enforceable in the state of Oklahoma. So it would prohibit the enforcement of Now, along with that, there's also a penalty for anybody that were trying to enforce it. It would be a felony conviction to try to stop any law enforcement from. But then the other thing that Washington, D.C. has become very crafty in, and this is something that a lot of Republicans are advocating for. On the federal level, there's Republicans and Democrats trying to create grant programs to incentivize, is a polite way of saying bribe, the states into implementing red flag laws. So the federal government which is bankrupt. They don't have any money, they're spending us into oblivion. They are going to borrow money from places like China, where right now protesters in Hong Kong are saying, we wish we had due process, we wish we had a Second Amendment, we wish we had ways to stand against our totalitarian government. So people in Hong Kong are protesting their government, and the United States government is going to borrow money from China, put future generations in debt, to use that money to try and bribe states and local governments to implement red flag laws to violate due process, the Second Amendment, and take away your rights. I mean, this is as ridiculous and excessive as you can get, but the federal government doesn't think anything of it. And the problem is, with these things, is we as humans, we're emotional beings. And when a tragedy happens, when something terrible happens, most people want to do something. It doesn't have to be the right thing. We just have to do something. Something must be done. Well, okay, but what exactly is that something? Is it violating constitutional rights? No. That should never be the response. That shouldn't be what we're about. But because they want to do something, because the media keeps plastering selective tragedies and trying to force that upon everyone, so that's always in the forefront, trying to fearmonger and push those things, Republicans become weak-kneed and they say, okay, well, we have to do something. So this is what we're going to do. I mean, even down in Texas, the governor and lieutenant governor are talking about doing red flag laws and universal background checks and these different things. I mean, I wouldn't have expected a Republican governor in Texas to be advocating for those things. So the third part of my bill would prohibit the state or any local entity, county, cities, any entity of the state of Oklahoma from accepting federal funds to implement those red flag laws. So I'm trying to cut it off on every possible scenario, any way that they're trying to implement these red flag laws. Yes, sir.
Senator, I'm all for what you want to do, but what do you do about the bloody supremacy clause when a federal judge issues the order?
Great question. But you have to read the supremacy clause. And this is a question that I've had asked by several reporters. This is a conversation that some of the Democrats have jumped on and said, well, the supremacy clause says that all federal laws are the supreme law of the land. That's not what it says. If you read the supremacy clause, it says this Constitution and all laws of the United States that are made in conformity with the Constitution. It doesn't say conformity, I'm using that modern term. But it says that it has to be in alignment with the Constitution. The federal government can't pass any law that they want. The federal government can't pass a law infringing upon freedom of speech, right? Or they can't establish a religion. They can't infringe on freedom of the press. Why? Because the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or freedom of speech or freedom of the press. They can't do that. So to say that they can pass whatever law they want to, and it's the supreme law of the land because of the supremacy clause, violates the other provisions of the Constitution. So it conflicts. So,
I agree with you, but what do you do when the U.S. Marshal is showing up on your doorstep saying, give me your gun?
Well, that's a decision that each individual is going to have to make. Call your sheriff, yes. Call your sheriff, yeah. Hopefully you have a sheriff that understands. But one other thing that I mentioned to people about this is they say, well, yeah, Oklahoma law can't violate federal law. And I say to them, you mean like how we have legal medical marijuana in this state, even though it's illegally federally? I mean, all the Democrats all the Democrat lawyers in the House that keep attacking me on this and saying, state law can't trump federal law, they all voted for it. It's hypocritical. There's no consistency there. The problem with so many people in elected office is if they didn't have double standards, they would have no standards at all. So it just depends on what's important to them, how they selectively apply things. So yeah, the supremacy clause, it's in there for a reason, but it's not a be-all, do-all, catch-all, because we have a 10th Amendment that says that there's only certain powers and authorities granted to the federal government, granted to them. They don't inherently have power or authority, it's just the power and authority we give to them. Everything else, we reserved for the states and for the people. Everything else. If it's not specifically listed there, and marijuana isn't, so the federal government has no authority to be involved with it, they don't have any authority. Second Amendment is listed, but not as something that the federal government can regulate. It's listed as shall not be infringed. So they don't have the authority to do that. Alex?
Can you touch on the adversarial aspect of this, being the fact that you're not really accused of doing anything in the first place, so you can't really defend yourself because there's no accusation of a crime in the first place. You have to go in there and disprove something that only exists in the imagination of your accuser. How do you possibly, first of all, the burden of proof is supposed to be on the state. Second of all, how do you go about defending yourself against something that hasn't happened, that they can't name might happen, and only exists in their imagination?
It's pre-crime. It's basically the movie Minority Report. It's science fiction. Because they're trying to say that you might be a threat at some point in time in the future, or they feel threatened.
Are we looking at basically the equivalent of the Salem witch trials system of due process here?
Essentially, yeah, and that's why we have due process protections. That's why the Bill of Rights says that you have the right to face your accuser, that you have the right to call testimony on your own behalf. That's why you have the right to have a lawyer, assistance of counsel, and all these things. It violates so many different provisions of the Bill of Rights. It's amazing how they've incorporated it all and put a nice sounding thing on it, red flag laws, because everybody knows what a red flag means. Like, okay, caution, something's wrong or potentially wrong. So yes, if you don't have the benefit of the doubt, you're automatically branded as you're in the wrong. There's, you're guilty until proven innocent.
And they can't even
just flies in the face.
You're maybe guilty of.
And you're not even told that there's an extreme risk protection order placed against you until the law enforcement shows up to confiscate your guns, like the gentleman in Maryland or Delaware, wherever it was, where he was killed. Yes, sir.
Well, I understand that the federal constitution and the state constitution are different when it comes to the Second Amendment. Is there any way we can make the Second Amendment of Oklahoma match up to the federal one?
So yes, the Oklahoma Constitution, it's interesting. Don has worked on bills for that in the past. I've worked with him on that. The Oklahoma Constitution says that basically it says the same thing, that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but nothing in this shall preclude the legislature from infringing upon this right and regulating this right if they so choose. So it says it can't be infringed unless the legislature chooses to infringe. But then there's another provision of the Oklahoma Constitution that also says that nothing in the Oklahoma Constitution can be contrary to the U.S. Constitution. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. The Oklahoma Constitution is a behemoth. So I'm going to get off on another trail. We can get back to the Second Amendment, but this is one of my pet peeves. The Oklahoma Constitution, when it was enacted, it was the largest governing document in the world. It's huge. If you just put it in typical book format, it's like 150 pages. It's a large, large document. Okay, it's not going to fit in your pocket like a U.S. pocket Constitution will. And so I've read the Oklahoma Constitution. Sadly, I'm one of only a few legislators that actually has read the entire Oklahoma Constitution, even though we all swore to uphold it. There is a lot of nonsense. There's a lot of things in there that shouldn't be in the Constitution. The one that a lot of people use, the best example, is the framers of the Oklahoma Constitution defined the flashpoint of kerosene in our Constitution. Not really something that needs to be constitutional, right? I mean, that's something that could be in our statute books that we can change. Apparently, dental work was very, very important around the turn of the century because in 1907, when we adopted our Constitution, they also included the Board of Dentistry as a constitutional agency. So if we ever want to make any changes to the Board of Dentistry, it takes a state constitutional amendment to change it. Okay, dental work, is important. Licensing dentists, we can get into that conversation, but it's not something that needs to be constitutional, right? I think most everybody would agree with that. Walmart was trying to put it in the Constitution for eyeglasses, correct? And they were using the example of we have the Board of Dentistry in there. So one of the problems that we face on the state level is we have over 20 constitutional agencies or entities in our Constitution that we're continually dealing with. I don't know if Don has ever brought this up, but the Department of Wildlife is in the Constitution, and so there have actually been game boards that have said the Fourth Amendment right to unreasonable searches and seizures does not apply to them because they are a state constitutional entity, and so the federal Constitution does not apply to them. So your rights under the Fourth Amendment don't apply to you. So there's a lot of problems we have under our state Constitution. It was created at the height of the progressive era by a bunch of socialist lawyers that have been ran out of Texas. Okay, so there's a lot of junk in it. Now, one thing that people don't realize is that, and when I reread the Constitution after I got elected because I wanted to make sure I was aware of it, going into being a state legislator. So I reread it, and I found this interesting provision. There's a provision in the Oklahoma Constitution that says every 20 years we have to send to a vote of the people and ask the people if they want to do a state constitutional convention to amend, replace, or change the state constitution. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I asked our Senate staff, I was like, I don't remember that vote being voted on recently. When was the last time we voted on it? And they said, oh, that was back in the 70s. I did some quick math and I realized that was more than 20 years ago. So I asked them, well, this is a requirement in the Constitution. Why haven't we done this? And they said, well, we did another one in the 90s, kind of. Instead of sending to a vote of the people if they wanted to do a constitutional convention, we sent to the vote of the people if they wanted to repeal that part, so we no longer had to keep sending it to them. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not what it says. And the people overwhelmingly said, no, we don't want to repeal that. We want to keep that provision in there. So I filed a bill that would require that we send to a vote of the people if they want to do a state constitutional convention. So as the young, naive, newly elected senator that I was, I went to the committee chairman that it had been assigned to his committee, the Rules Committee, which I now know is where they send bills to die. I didn't know that at that point in time. So I went to him and I said, hey, Senator, I have this bill, it sends it to a vote of the people, state constitutional convention. When are you planning on hearing the bill? His answer was, well, I'm not planning on hearing that. I'm like, no, this is the bill that's required by the Constitution. We do this every 20 years. He said, yeah, I'm not hearing that bill. And I said, no, it's been over 20 years. We're past due on this. And he said, well, it's been over 20 years, what's a few more years? And I said, well, it's required by the Constitution. And he said, yeah, but nobody really cares about that. I said, well, I really care about it, and I would appreciate it if you would hear the bill. And he said, no. And so I have had that bill for the 7 years that I've been up there. I've had a version of it every year since I've been up there because it's something that is required by the Constitution. And I'll be honest, I don't think if we do a state constitutional convention, we will get much worse of a constitution than we currently have. I don't think that there's some real concerns with that. There's some things that we can put into place. I mean, we can't have a worse version of our Second Amendment in the state constitution than what we currently have, so there's no real threat of opening up Pandora's box. Now, let me make abundantly clear, this is different than the Article 5 Constitutional Convention, Convention of the States that's referenced in the state or in the federal constitution. If you want more information about that, I'm sure Charlie can talk to you about that, fill you in on that whole topic. So that's a whole separate thing. So this was talking about the state constitutional convention, about the different things that we could change on the state level. So long answer to your question about the current state. So that's one methodology that we could use to clarify that, is if it was a state constitutional convention, we could clarify our Second Amendment. Otherwise, it's going to have to go to a vote of the people. And I know Don can work more.
Well, somewhat, but my problem with it is that, no offense, Dave, but cops swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. But if you ask one, which Constitution are you upholding? I hope they say the U.S. one, but not necessarily so if the state one differs.
And I agree with you. Legislators swear an oath to uphold the Constitution too, and most of them haven't read either one of them. So it's that's more of an education issue and more of talking to law enforcement, cops, and legislators, and making sure that they understand what shall not be infringed means. We get that clarified in the state constitution. I get where you're coming from, though. It's in conflict. Charlie?
A minute ago, you used the term granted to the federal government. That almost sounds like you believe that the federal government was a creation of the states rather than the states being a creation of the federal government. What is the truth on all that?
That's not like that, does it? So, yes, I'm a strong proponent, strong believer that it was the states that created the federal government, not the other way around. And so we are not beholden to the federal government. They are supposed to work on our behalf. So I often will ask this, and I tell everybody it's a trick question. Now knowing a little bit of what I've talked about, you might be able to figure it out. But I always ask people, and I'm telling you, you're going to get it wrong, but if you want to try, I'll let you answer it. What are the three branches of American government as outlined in the U.S. Constitution?
Legislative, executive, and judicial.
Legislative, executive, and judicial? No. Told you get it wrong, okay? And here's why. I didn't ask what the three branches of the federal government are. I asked what the three branches of American government are. So there's a difference. Because if you read through the Constitution, you'll see that it talks about three different entities. It talks about the federal government, it talks about the states, and it talks about the people. Those are the three true branches of American government. Within the federal government, we have the executive, legislative, and judicial. On the federal side, we have the same thing on the state side. We have those three branches. But the Founding Fathers talk often about states and the people. And there's one good provision in the Oklahoma Constitution, and it says in our preamble, or early on in the Constitution, it says all political power is inherent in the people. That's true. That's where government and politicians, and that's where government gets its authority from. It's from the people. Now, sometimes people will say that I'm a states' rights proponent, and I like to clarify this too. I'm not a proponent of states' rights because states don't have rights. Only people have rights. I challenge you to read the Constitution. Every time it mentions a right, it mentions the people. Whenever it's talking about the states, or it's talking about the federal government, it talks about the powers. The legislative power, the executive power, the judicial power shall be vested in a Supreme Court and such inferior courts as Congress shall from time to time. It talks about power. Think of it as the power of attorney, right? You can give your attorney or your spouse the power of attorney to operate on your behalf, correct? Or you can, in some instances, give that to somebody else, a business partner or someone else, but you can give them that power to operate on your behalf. That's what the states did for the federal government. We said, okay, federal government, we're going to give you the power and the authority to operate on our behalf on these things. And if you read Article 1, Section 8, something else that's very interesting in that is how often they use the term uniform. They talk about a uniform currency. They talk about uniform weights and measures. This is my favorite example. It wouldn't really work here in the United States if Rhode Island being small says that 4 ounces equals a pound, Oklahoma says 16 ounces equals a pound, and our neighbors to the south, everything having to be bigger in Texas, would say 32 ounces equals a pound. That wouldn't work, would it? No, there's certain things that have to be uniform. We have to have uniformity in weights and measures, in our currency, in our military, in the training of the officers. Those are the things that have to be uniform. Everything outside of that, it doesn't have to be uniform. The way we educate our children here in the state of Oklahoma doesn't have to be like how they do it in California. Thank goodness. You know, I mean, the way that we do like anything. I mean, you know, we're a different society. We're a different people. We're more agrarian and have more farmers and ranchers in a lot of ways. We shouldn't have a small landlocked East Coast state telling us how we need to live our lives. That's not what the Founding Fathers envisioned. So the federal government has limited powers, not rights. They have limited powers, and they should be all about protecting rights. So let me say this, and I'll take another question. At the state capitol, a lot of times we talk about what is the proper function of government, what is a core function of government, and you know, people will inevitably go to roads and bridges, education, healthcare, whatever. On the state level, they'll think about, well, that's a core function of government. That's a main thing the government should be doing. But I always like to go back to the Declaration of Independence. Okay, how many people remember in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Right? You all remember that. But we often forget the very next part of it. It says, you know, we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. To secure these rights, governments are instituted. Governments are created to secure our rights. That is the core function of every level of government, whether it's county commissioner, county sheriff, whether it's a city, whether it's the state, the federal government, whether it's a school board. They should be about protecting our rights. That should be the core function of government. But not enough people understand that, and so that's why we have to educate legislators and other elected officials on this is the way you should be about it. You should be about protecting individuals' rights. And obviously, red flag laws fly in the face of that in so many ways. Charlie?
Last Thursday night, I was in Tulsa, and Senator Stanislawski was one of the speakers. He did an excellent job. He's the chairman of the Senate Education Committee, detailing some of the real problems with the influence of the NEA and the OEA in our schools, and basically how anti-Christian, anti-American much of the agenda of the schools are. And so I asked him this question. Gary, you did a really good job of laying this out. What percentage of your colleagues in the Republican Party have the same understanding you do, and what percentage of those in the Democrat Party? His answer was about 40% of his colleagues in the Republican Party have the understanding he has, meaning 60 do not. When it comes to the Democrat side, they embrace everything that's immoral, anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-free enterprise. My question to you is, what percentage of your colleagues do you believe have even 90% of the understanding of the Constitution as you have related tonight, and whatever percentage that doesn't have that, how can we educate them?
Great questions. I wouldn't be able to put, I mean, it depends on what you're talking about. If it's education, there might be more of us.
The Constitution, both Oklahoma and federal.
On the Oklahoma Constitution, there's very few people that know it. Like I said, it's a behemoth. It takes a lot to read. So very few people have ever even read the Oklahoma Constitution. So I would say that's a small number. On the U.S. level, I mean, we have several members of the military that served in the armed forces, so they at least read the Constitution at some point in time and everything, and I think they might have somewhat of an understanding. The thing that I'll say about most of the people in the legislature is that I do believe that a majority of them have a good heart, or they want to do the right thing. The problem is, if you don't have core principles, it depends on what the right thing is. So how do you decide what the right thing is? Well, if you're going up against the Constitution, well, that's an easy way to measure it. So I'll say this. A lot of people in the legislature or the lobbyists or different people will say, well, Nathan's all about his ideology. No, I'm not about my ideology. I'm about the Constitution. This is not my ideology. I was not there when this was drafted and written. Okay, this is not my ideas. I didn't, come up with the idea and think, hey, the right to keep and bear arms is really good. We should protect it. I agree with that ideology, but I didn't come up with that. I didn't write "shall not be infringed." They did, because they also understood that. So this isn't my ideology, but a lot of times people think that is. And so I'm all about the Constitution. I try to focus on higher authorities. So the Constitution is the highest authority when it comes to federal issues, obviously. The state constitution is. The Bible is the supreme authority, in my opinion, and in my belief. So I try to defer to higher authorities than just my own ideals. Unfortunately, a lot of people in the legislature, they don't have those principles on how they make their decisions. They're not basing it on what's constitutional or what's biblical. What they're basing it on depends on the individual. Some of them base it on what's polling. What does the majority want? So they'll base it on that. Some of them are basing it on, well, how will this help my social media profile? Will I get more likes and follows? I mean, truthfully, some of it are basing it on, will people get upset at me? I don't want anybody to be upset at me. So that's why one group comes in and they can agree with them. Another group comes in saying the exact opposite thing and they agree with them. Because they're basing their decisions on, I don't want anybody to be upset at me. And so it just depends on the individual. And so that's why it's so important, and you get to know the different legislators and know what impacts them. Some of them, hardly ever hear from their constituents, so if they get 5 emails from their constituents, okay, well, then that's how they're going to make their decision. Which is bad if they're getting 5 emails saying, hey, pass red flag laws, and they're going to make that decision. But it's good if they're getting 5 emails saying, hey, don't pass red flag laws, and they decide to go with it. So you just got to learn each individual person. A lot of it is personality. A lot of it is high school and middle school cliques and different things like that. I mean, that's just the reality of how a lot of it operates. I mean, it's politics, unfortunately.
Money.
You had your hand up first.
Of course, I think everyone is sure that the red flag laws are important, but I actually know people who had their weapons seized after an emergency, like a PPO. And I want to know if you have any ideas about what can be done to fix maybe more of a bright line standard for judges when they can and cannot order firearms seized without adjudicating somebody that's mentally deficient or the other standards.
Well, and that's the thing. We currently have laws on the books for ways to go about that, but for the most part, those laws are fairly good on due process. Now, I still think that we need to solidify some things on due process. But red flag laws just entirely do away with due process, being able to see the accusations made against you. So that's the thing, is red flag laws are unnecessary. If somebody truly is threatening someone else or a threat to themselves, we have laws on the books on ways to be able to protect those people. So, and the difference with that, and there's some people that would say PPOs and all that stuff is entirely unconstitutional. Like and in some states the way they go about it is because there is no due process. But with that, if the focus is on protecting life because you're protecting rights and you're still going about it through a due process, then that's better of a system. But you just still have to be about protecting rights, and that's what it should be about. Red flag laws are not about protecting rights. It's all about going after the scary firearm because that's what people are afraid of, which a firearm is just a tool. If somebody is going to threaten to blow up a building or bomb something, you don't just go and see if they have bomb-making materials. You go and find out if that individual is an actual threat and you deal with the individual. So that's what it should be about, is dealing with the individual if they're actually a true threat or have threatened or have caused harm. Yes, sir.
Hey, thank you, Senator Dahm, for everything that you do, sir. I'm going to give you one of those get in trouble questions. What percentage of your Republican colleagues at 23rd and Lincoln understand entirely that they are violating their oaths and just don't care?
Truthfully, I don't know how many of them understand that they're violating their oaths. And I don't think any of them don't care. I think they do care, but it's what do they care about, okay? One of my favorite quotes was from a pastor around the Civil War era. It was actually in a poem that he wrote, and I paraphrase it now, but he said that the difference between a politician and a statesman is that a politician is thinking always about the next election, whereas a statesman is thinking about the next generation. So most of them do care, but they care about getting reelected. And then the rationalization for that is, well, if I can get elected, then I can continue to do good. But what is the good that is being done? Is it constitutional or not? So I think that it can be rationalized in their minds. It's not so much the focus on the Constitution, on individual rights. And one of the biggest reasons for that, one of the biggest concerns that I have with it, is because we are told by the media nonstop, we're taught this in school nonstop, we hear it all the time. I mean, America has always been on the forefront of making the world safe for what? We've got to make the world safe for democracy, right? We hear about democracy all the time. You know, we're the world's leader in democracy. No, we are not. We are not a democracy. A democracy is simple majority. 51% gets to tell the other 49% what to do. Or like Franklin said, you know, democracy is 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. Okay, that's what democracy is. And then he followed up and said a republic is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote. And so we are not a democracy, but we hear that all the time. And so most of the legislators believe that we are a democracy. And so they think, well, if 51% of my constituents want something, want red flag laws or bans on free speech or whatever, I have to do that because that's what my constituents want. No, we're there to represent our constituents within the confines of the Constitution. This is the guidebook. We can't violate this. They can't violate it. And so if people want us to violate it, we can't. That's the reality of it. But they don't see it that way. They just think, well, we're a simple democracy. Democracy is not written in the Declaration of Independence. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in any of the founding documents. But you know what this does say in here? It says, the federal government shall guarantee to every state a republican form of government. We are a union of republics. That's what we are. And yes, within those states, we use the democratic system to vote in certain regards, certain aspects. But people think, well, yeah, but you know, the majority of my constituents want this. That's not true. The majority of your constituents don't vote. I mean, truthfully, you're not elected by a majority of your constituents when you run for office. There's how many people here in Logan County?
45,000.
45,000. Do all 40, thereabouts, okay? Do all 45,000 of them get out and vote in every election? No. So you're not elected in a democracy. Yes, we vote, and so it's a democratic process. But so when they start, and that's something that we really need to educate legislators and other people on is, we are not a democracy. We are a union of republics, a constitutional republic. And so I think that would help them to understand that they're not just supposed to do the will of the people, they're supposed to do the will of their constituents within the confines of the Constitution and those parameters, if that makes sense. How are we doing on time? Yes, sir. I'll come to you next.
I feel your pain on not getting your bill heard. My question is for issues like that, where it appears they're pretty clearly violating their oath of office. Could we ever get any traction? And obviously you have to pick your battles carefully. But could we ever get any traction by initiating a recall petition?
We don't have recall on legislators here in the state of Oklahoma.
Oh.
So you can't do that. There are pros and cons to that. I mean, yes, if we had that, you could do that to legislators, but if we had that, there would be plenty of people, there's a lot of money coming after me. They would put a lot of money in behind trying to get me recalled.
Yeah.
So it cuts both ways. Just like term limits. Term limits are good, that it gets rid of all the riffraff, but we also lose great people like Senator Sykes, who served well for 12 years, was a huge champion, one of my mentors, really helped me, and now he's not in there anymore. And the guy who replaced him is a good guy, but he's, you know, I mean, he's new, he's still learning the process and stuff, but we've lost Senator Sykes because of that. Now, we also lost some bad people in recent years with term limits.
Here.
Yeah, we lost him. And I worked with both of them. So term limits cuts both ways, recommendations cut both ways. I mean, yeah, there's good and bad with it. I'll come back to you in a second. Yes, sir.
I remember you talked about the electoral college, and the statement you made right before the last was how they have the mindset that we're a democratic democracy. And you think that mindset is what's driving people trying to ban the electoral college?
Absolutely, that's where it's coming from with the democracy. It's saying that, well, the majority of the people voting in the presidential election should choose who is president. Well, no, that's not the way it was set up. The presidency was supposed to be a figurehead anyways. The presidency was not supposed to have all the power and the authority that it has right now. One thing that you can try to reach people with, sometimes they'll understand this, they'll get this, is they'll say, imagine the power that you're granting to whoever it is right now, whether it's to be able to do, red flag laws, or to be able to violate free speech. You think that it's okay right now because you have the authority for it. It's in your hands. You have the reins. But imagine the worst political opponent you can think of and passing the reins over to them. Because that's what happens. I mean, that's what, once you give government authority, the people that are in government at that point in time are not always the ones that are going to be wielding that authority. And so that's why the Founding Fathers didn't look at it and say, well, we need a majority of, the populace to vote for the president, and the president is going to be this dictator and be able to issue all these things. No, the presidency was supposed to be very limited in power. It was supposed to be more of a figure on its original power and authority. So that's why I want to strongly support the Electoral College. A few years ago in the state of Oklahoma, the national popular vote was passed through the Senate. It's stalled over on the House, thankfully. The national popular vote is constitutional. It is a way that you could say, well, no, Oklahoma, however our people vote, that's how we're going to direct our electors to vote. It's a terrible idea, but it is constitutional. That's not a path we need to go down, so I'm going to continue to fight that. And if you want to hear more about the Electoral College, come out on October, what date? Yeah. October 5th, all right? It's only $10, come down there. And there'll be other good speakers as well.
So can we run an initiative petition to put a constitutional convention for the state on a ballot for the people to vote on?
We could, but I will say I've talked with Governor Stitt's administration, and they are very interested in doing it themselves. That's something that they want to look at. They recognize there's a lot of changes that need to be made to the state constitution. So I'm in conversations with them right now. I will say I also talked with Governor Fallon's people about it. They had no interest in it. They said they did not want that to be her legacy. So they went a different route with her legacy. And so I tried to talk with them, but Governor Stitt and his administration aren't interested in doing that.
If it didn't happen, though, we're about 180,000 signatures away from doing it ourselves.
Correct, yes. And there's a whole lot to that, so there's a lot I can get into with that. Of the way that we wanted to go about doing it would mirror what was originally done in the first state constitutional convention, with equal representation across the state, with members of the legislature, with lay members, with members of the judiciary, the executive branch. There's all kinds of different ways we can do it. I think we need to have some protections in there to say that maybe we don't address anything that had been voted in by the vote of the people in a certain recent time frame. I mean, there's some really old stuff that we can change or do away with, but we want to protect. I mean, we don't want to undo stuff that's been done, just recently that the will of the people was expressed in that. So there's some provisions in that of different ways that we can go about doing that.
A little off topic, but still some of the general idea here. I was kind of curious about the way that we appoint state Supreme Court justices in the state. They're picked by the Bar Association, which is in fact a union group, gives a list to the governor of judges that they approve of that he can pick from. What would it take to change that?
So the JNC, the Judicial Nominating Commission, they're the ones that they are in the Constitution. So that is something that would require a constitutional amendment to change that provision of it. Now, there are other things that could be done outside of that. And Senator Sykes, he was the chairman of Judiciary, I was his vice chairman. We ran several bills. We could put mandatory age limit or retirement ages on several of them. There's a lot of different things we could do statutorily. But to really change the system, it's going to take a state constitutional convention or amendment to fully change it. There's other things we can put in there. We can make the Bar Association open to the Public Meetings Act so that they actually have to publicly discuss how they're going about picking some of the nominees. Part of it they could do privately, but because we have that provision in Open Meetings Act, they can go into executive sessions. But there's some things that we can do with that. I think that's one of the biggest things that needs to be addressed, both on the state and the federal level, is the runaway judiciary. They are legislating from the bench. The Supreme Court here on the state level is notorious for that. It's terrible. Okay, so I'm going to go on a whole different rant now that you opened up that box on the federal level. Another question, if anybody wants to try and dive into it. How many Supreme Court justices does the Constitution say should exist?
It
doesn't. It does mention at one point in time, it does mention the Chief Justice, but it doesn't say how many there should be. In fact, when you read Article 3 about the judiciary, it's the smallest portion of the Constitution. Right? It says, the judicial power shall be vested in a Supreme Court and such inferior courts, we have inferior courts, such inferior courts as Congress shall from time to time ordain and establish. So let me ask you this. We hear all the time that we have three co-equal branches of government. The president, the legislature, and the judiciary, they are co-equals. In what other scenarios do you have co-equals when one of the branches, the legislature, sets all the parameters for the other branch in the judiciary? How are they co-equals?
Exactly.
The Congress is the one that said that there's 9 Supreme Court justices. Congress has created all of the different federal courts. Congress has authority over them. Congress can uncreate them at any time. In fact, I remember hearing one congressman, former Majority Leader DeLay, one time was speaking at a conference, and I didn't know he had done this. I had always said we need to do something like this. When he was in, he tried to move, I think it was the 99th or one of the courts. He tried to move them out to Guam and totally unfund them, so that if they wanted to issue their crazy edicts and everything, they'd have to fly out to Guam without any staff and actually meet and do that. So, I mean, there's ways that Congress can go about reining in the judiciary. I contend even that the Constitution doesn't say that they have lifetime appointments. It says that they shall serve during periods of good behavior. And I would contend that legislating from the bench, extending beyond your constitutional authority, violating the Constitution, saying that Obamacare was a tax, and then realizing that, well, it started as a Senate bill, which all tax bills have to start in the House. So I would say that even some of those things would be a violation of good behavior, and so they could be removed. Judges can be impeached. They could be removed. And so that's something on the federal level that could be looked at, that's something on the state level. The judicial branch is one of the most out-of-balance branches on both the state and the federal level. So that's something that really needs to be looked at. It's something that Senator Sykes and I and others have been working at. I will say the biggest problem, the biggest challenge to that right now is the House, because there's a lot of lawyers in the House that once they're out of the House, they want to serve as judges, so they don't want to do anything to rock the boat. And so that's the biggest problem right now is the House. We did pass one really good bill. I had the bill 2 years ago, and then Senator Julie Daniels out of Bartlesville, she passed it this last year. She's phenomenal. I really appreciate her. It would change our Supreme Court, the judicial lines, because right now the way it's set up, it's by different counties, and it was done like back in the 60s based on the congressional districts back then. So this would just realign it and say, we're going to have one for each congressional district, and then the other ones are going to be at large. Just makes it a lot clearer, but it also gives us the opportunity to get a better pool of judges from different areas to get on the bench in the future. So a lot of information on judicial branch there. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, on the federal level, we have the Supreme Court, and they're making laws.
They're trying to.
Well, when Kavanaugh was up for approval, and he was asked about, I think it was Roe versus Wade and same-sex marriage, his comment was, it was settled law. Right then, he's saying that the Supreme Court made the law.
And if you think of most of the challenges that we face today, most of the sweeping things, whether it's the Obergefell decision with gay marriage, abortion with Roe v. Wade, if you think of these different things, there's no law. There's a Supreme Court opinion on it. And the Supreme Court, that's what they do. They issue opinions. They don't write the laws. There's still laws on the books. I mean, in Oklahoma, we still have laws on the books outlining abortion. And in our state constitution, we have a constitutional provision defining marriage. So those are the laws on the books, but then we have a Supreme Court decision that the Supreme Court has decided that that they have the authority. again, the Supreme Court is not, they're not supposed to be a co-equal branch. Yes, they have a role to play. If you ever go to the Capitol in Washington, D.C., first of all, I'm sorry, but also, there's some nice things you can see. If you tour the Capitol building, the old Senate chambers was actually the Supreme Court chambers at different times. They were in the Capitol building. When they got their own building and moved off-site, and then they elevated themselves to the status, that was one of the biggest mistakes I think that was made, because it did elevate them to the status where they believe that 5 people, not 435 congressmen, 100 senators, president, but 5 people in fancy black robes think that they can dictate to the rest of the country what to do. And now we're even seeing some federal judges where one judge thinks that they can, implement an order restraining the President of the United States or the executive branch from faithfully executing their duties and responsibilities. So I think that the judicial branch is one of the biggest things that needs to be reformed on the state and the federal level. And I've gone toe-to-toe with lawyers on this. And I mean, not to say anything too bad about lawyers. I don't think I have to. I apologize if there's any lawyers in the room. But it's a self-perpetuating system. You have lawyers that are fighting other lawyers, and they're fighting in front of a lawyer that's a judge, and so it's a little kingdom unto itself, and they think that they should be able to dictate to the rest of us how to live our lives, and they're not necessarily always focused on protecting rights like they should be. So.
I have one question for you real quick.
Yes, sir.
What would you say on an individual or party level? Because there's so many instances in our legislature of them killing bills that are in line with their constitution, like SB 13, them killing that bill, or other bills like the anti-earthquake or the Piers Morgan bill that you did. Like, what should we do as constituents, number one, but also the party? What can we do to affect it? What can give us teeth, or what should we do from your perspective as a legislator?
So former Representative Charles Key, phenomenal gentleman as well, did a great job in the legislature. He's been trying to work on this. He has a book on explaining how the rules work in the legislature, how they effectively shelve bills and kill bills and do all that stuff behind the scenes before it ever sees the light of day and everything. And one thing that he's trying to work on is a way to force a change to the rules. And there's different ideas of how to go about that. Some people say, well, every legislator should be able to have at least one bill heard every session, at least in committee. And I agree with that, because they represent their constituency. And yeah, that means that there's going to be some people on the far left that are going to be, they might choose their red flag law, this is what I want. Or they might choose any number of crazy ideas and say, like universal basic income, this is what I'm going to propose, or $20 an hour minimum wage. That might be the case. Fine, here's the bill, vote it down, vote no. But there's a lot of people scared to take that stance. They'd rather it not be heard. So I'm okay with that. I'm okay with allowing at least one bill for each member to be heard, because I don't think the committee chairman should be able to stifle all of my constituents' voice. Right. And that's what happens. So one thing that I proposed several times in the state senate, we have a rule that right now that with 2/3 majority of the members of the Senate, you can get a bill discharged from committee and brought directly to the floor.
Right. Yep.
It's never been done since I've been up there. I've told other people about it. It's an option. But I have to pass a bill with 51% majority. Why do I have to get 2/3 majority to get a bill heard? Because it's a higher threshold and it's a way for them to control it. I've advocated, and I'm currently the chairman of General Government Committee, which has oversight on counties, cities, random stuff, statewide things. So when I was chairman of the committee, my policy was I will hear every bill that any member wants heard. And I caught a lot of flack for that, because we heard bill to do away with daylight saving time. We've heard all kinds of different things that, can be controversial, and Senate leadership doesn't like it because, well, you're putting us in the news looking like kooks and all kinds of crazy stuff. I'm like, members want their bills heard, I'm going to hear their bills. That was my policy. Now, I will say a couple of years ago I changed, because I wanted to do a pilot program, and I told everybody I was going to do this pilot program. I said, we have the 2/3 where you can discharge a bill out of the Senate directly to the floor. We should have a similar discharge thing on the committee level. So I said, I'm willing to even make it a higher threshold of 3/4. Okay? If there's a bill that I adamantly don't like, or I don't think it should be heard, or I think it's unconstitutional, or whatever the case might be, I'm not going to hear the bill unless you get 3/4 of the committee members to sign a petition saying they want the bill heard, and then I'll hear the bill. Because I don't believe a committee chairman should be able to stop any bill arbitrarily. And so I implemented that, and I've told like 4 or 5 people, and 1 or 2 of them said, okay, I'm not even going to worry about it. 3 of them got the signatures, and I heard their bill. I voted no. I voted no on the floor. I fought against it. I did everything I could. None of them actually became law. None of them went forward. But there needs to be some ways to kind of have a relief valve for that, because the system is set up right now to where only a few select people can make the decisions to determine what happens. And I feel that's adamantly wrong, because we do have a representative form of government. Not a democracy, but representative. And when one committee chairman can say, hey, I'm not going to hear your bill, he's stifling the voice of all of my constituents. So I'm trying to work on some changes like that. I'm not going to stop on that. I'm going to continue to try to get that as a Senate rule change. But that's something that needs to happen. As far as what individuals can do is just try to put pressure on the committee chairman to hear the bills. But the system is set up to protect those that they want to protect, unfortunately.
I believe last year you co-authored SB 13. It was one of the bills that was killed in the committee. And I understand that bill is also coming forward again in this next session. Could you take a moment and speak on that bill, and obviously be supporting it again? Maybe for those that aren't familiar with it, could you take a few moments and speak on it?
Sure. And so you asked about SB 13, which would be a bill to abolish abortion here in the state of Oklahoma. There were a few senators that signed on as co-authors, and most of them all dropped off after they got pressured. I stayed on it because I believe that the state has not just the authority, but the right to protect life, or the responsibility to protect life. So that bill would basically make null and void, of no effect, Roe v. Wade, any federal infringements upon abortion, and it would just say abortion is illegal here in the state of Oklahoma. We're going to protect life. That's what I believe government should be about. We should be about protecting life. There's religious arguments for that, obviously, but the 14th Amendment also says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. There's no due process, there's an unborn child involved in that. And so government has a responsibility to protect that life. So Senator Joseph Silk, out of the southeast part of the state, he was the primary sponsor on that. He caught a lot of flack for that. I caught a lot of flack for being his co-author, but I'm not there to not catch flack. I'm there to protect rights. So I had no problem staying on as that. So that bill was never heard in committee. It wasn't heard on the floor. But that means it's still an active measure, so it could be brought up this next year. But I know that Senator Silk and Senator Bullard are working on similar legislation as well. I've done a lot of pro-life bills in the past. In fact, we filed one that would have effectively eliminated abortion here in the state, and Governor Fallon vetoed it. So, I've been very vocal in this about what I believe government's role is in this and protecting life. So I'm going to continue that fight, but right now they're kind of leading the charge on that. So I'm just backing them up and supporting them. In fact, Senator Bullard sent me a bill right now, the current draft. I just picked it up in my office today. I haven't looked at it yet, but he's working on some things. So we're going to continue the fight for the unborn as well.
If for any reason you're not able to go that far with it, since the left has decided that there can be reasonable restrictions on rights, have you considered the idea of a permitting process, and paying a fee and fingerprinting through the state, all of that, since that's a reasonable restriction?
So I haven't thought about doing that on the right to life, but I have, when I've been interviewed by reporters and everything, I have asked them, so how would you feel if you had to go through an OSBI background check and pay $250, and then wait until you got your permit to be able to exercise the right to freedom of press? Would that be okay with you? Are you all right if we do that for, and I've even considered writing a full bill and filing that and calling it the Freedom of Press Act, just like our Self-Defense Act, and putting all those same stipulations on them, because it makes no sense. Or the same thing for freedom of religion. Can you imagine if pastors had to go through, the background check and do all that stuff and everything to be able to freely exercise their religion? Or any of us for free speech, if you had to get that permit to be able to post something on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, it doesn't make any sense, especially when it's the one right that says, shall not be infringed. Yes, sir, the radical in the back.
I want you to run that bill because I don't want these preachers to get off their butt and show up at the Capitol to tell you it's wrong. Otherwise, they just sit back on their pews and, oh, we can't violate our tax status because something will be upset.
$1,000 fee.
Most preachers don't have the guts to stand up for what they believe.
Not just most preachers, most people.
Well, but preachers are ones.
But it doesn't take a majority, even though we're not a democracy. I mean, what's the famous quote? It takes a tireless minority willing to set brush fires in the minds of mankind. That's why we have people here tonight. I encourage all of you. One thing that does often hold a lot of sway with legislators is when they hear from their constituents, because they know that it's not just you, but there's people behind you. There's your family and your friends that if you want to get them stirred up, you can. And so the one thing that I do try to encourage people, if you don't know who your legislators are, meet them. Meet them for coffee, meet your House rep, your senator, your county commissioners, everybody that you can. But the first time you meet them, don't go in there chastising them, okay? Even if they're already doing a terrible job, okay? Or if you think they're doing a terrible job and disagree with them. First time you meet with them, go in and ask them. Just say, hey, I want to introduce myself to you. I'm your constituent. I want to just hear. I want to see if I can be a help. I want to get to know you. I want to see if there's something I can pray for you or your family about. At least start off with that, okay? Because we get people yelling at us and screaming at us all the time. And, you know, I don't know about you, but I've never had somebody screaming at me and yelling at me and cussing me out and saying, they made some really good points. I think, that's just not the way it goes about. So, at least the first time, they should know your names. You should meet with them enough that they know your name, they know who you are. But at least try to, initiate it by being cordial and getting to know them first before you, go after them with both barrels and tell them, it says shall not be infringed. Before you do that, at least try and meet them on a more personal level. Because ultimately, they are people. They have flaws. We all do. I'm not perfect. I have flaws. I'm a person. I deal with challenges. I deal with emotional things. There's if a family member is going through something that weighs on me. I mean, there's you never know what somebody else is going through. So keep that in mind. Ultimately, they are people. A lot of them don't think they're people. They think they're better because they think they're a senator or a rep. So that is part of it too. But ultimately, they are people. So you got to treat them like people, and you got to try and let them know that you do care about them, and you want them to do what's right. And a lot of times, I go a long way. You have time for one more, or is that it?
You guys want to have one more?
Let's go with this lady because she hasn't asked one. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to know, is there something that we can do to help support the anti-red flag law?
Okay, so she asked about what we can do to support the anti-red flag law. Right now, our session doesn't start until February. It's Senate Bill 1081. Okay, Senate Bill 1081. Contact your state rep and your state senator and ask them to co-author the bill. Ask them to sign on as a co-author. If they say, no, I'm not going to do that, that's a pretty good indicator that they don't support it. If we get a lot of people to co-author it, that's usually a good momentum, meaning that the bill needs to be heard. That's the first step for right now, is just trying to get enough people on board, find out where they stand. That's a good indicator of where they stand on that kind of stuff. So you can ask them if they've heard of the bill, ask them if they support the bill, ask them if they'll co-author the bill. I will say this, sometimes members will co-author a bill so their name is on it publicly, and then behind the scenes they'll work against it. It does happen, shocking, but at least if they're on it publicly, then if we get enough of them, then that could be some momentum behind it. So let me just close with this. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you. It is an honor and a privilege just to share my heart, to talk about the Constitution. It's a document that I love and appreciate. Thank you to all of you that have helped me and supported me throughout the years. I'm on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, just Nathan Dahm, at Nathan Dahm. Find me on that stuff. If I can help you, even though I'm not your senator, I have a wonderful lady at the state capitol, Sharon Brown. She was Charles Keyes, his EA back in that day. She does a phenomenal job helping with legislators or with constituent things. So if there's something I can help you with, even if you aren't my constituent, that's what I'm up there for. I want to help if I can be of help in any way. But thank you for what you all do and the honor and privilege of being here tonight and serving you all. Thank you. Thank you.
So guys, we're definitely going to try to get Senator Nathan Dahm back here in the next year or so. So that was just awesome.